Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is session 2 of our series, Understanding Our Political Economy with Edward Dodson.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to pick up tonight with the continuation of what I covered last week, and that is the arising of economics to take over the sort of academic and intellectual framework that had been prepared for centuries by the political economists, and to discuss a little bit more about what some people thought about that, and what is pretty clear. And by the way, again, please feel free to interrupt me if you have questions or comments. Just use your yellow hand in your reaction mode to get my attention, and hopefully I will pick up the fact that you'd like to enter in the discussion. But the more you engage with me, the less I have to lecture, and that's always a good thing. So where do we begin? Well, this is just a photograph of one of the European universities where a lot of young men from the United States and from the English-speaking countries went to study economics in the late 19th century. And they sought academic credentials in these European universities to help them get a leg up in their professional lives. Coming back to the United States with these credentials, with many of the universities now beginning to establish economics departments, the PhD was a basic requirement. And those professors who were teaching political economy often did not have a doctorate, or they had a PhD in philosophy. So you see the beginnings of the breakup of the discipline into subdisciplines, philosophy being one of them, economics being another, sociology, political science, So this is the beginning of this trend, but it wasn't fully welcomed by everyone, for sure. There's a lot of dissent within the academic community. Now, in the United States, the big center of this change starts out with Columbia University. Columbia becomes center stage for what becomes an intellectual and political storm over what is going to be taught and how it's going to be taught. And it begins to happen in the late 1800s, of course. Columbia is able to attract some well-schooled leaders in the new discipline, one of whom is E.R.A. Seligman. He becomes Columbia's chairman of the Department of Economics, and he is doing this at a time when Henry George is still alive and lecturing and writing and teaching. And so the two of them clash in public from time to time. But one of the differences between the two of them is Seligman has money behind him, with financial donations at Columbia from people like J.P. Morgan. So under Seligman, Columbia University's economics department grows to be one of the largest in the United States, and its faculty one of the most vigorous in defending the status quo. You'd think that people would have a greater desire to search for truth, but that's limited in some respects by who's paying the bills. You can think about that all the way to our modern era, and there's a lot of criticism. There's always been a lot of criticism about what people write about and how they develop their ideas based on who's supporting them financially. Well, another player in this game was John Bates Clark, and he debated Henry George in 1890 on, quote, the moral basis of property and land. So the land question is still a very prominent, important question that hasn't been resolved. The political economists have been writing about it. Henry George believes he's solved the problem, at least intellectually, if not politically. He's gotten, the idea to a mass audience all around the world, and he has many supporters. But there is resistance within this blossoming intellectual community in the universities. And John Bates Clark ends up at Columbia in 1895. I've mentioned Mason Gaffney before last week, and some of his comments about his discipline I will bring back to the discussion from time to time. He was a longtime professor of economics at the University of California. And in 1994, with an economic analyst and journalist, Fred Harrison, that many of you, I'm sure, know well, they co-authored a very stinging historical study of the discipline and the organized effort by those in the discipline to actually discredit Henry George's analysis of political economy. And they titled their book, The Corruption of Economics. And if you can get hold of a copy of the book, it's well worth reading to get a sense of how threatening Henry George's analysis was to the likes of J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and the robber barons and the industrialists of that age. And so, Gaffney and Fred Harrison, they tell the story of how those who had the financial ability to do so were going to try to silence Henry George, or at least create a whole generation of teachers at the college and university level, and perhaps even trickle down to lower levels of education, who would accept a whole different way of thinking about how the world is organized and how it works. And that the land question, as developed by Henry George and other political economists, would be basically written out of that analysis. Gaffney recalls what happened to this professor, Alan Eaton, who was found guilty of being a champion of Henry George's analysis. He writes as follows. He tells us, Professor Alan Eaton was fired from the University of Oregon for successfully pushing a series of characteristically Georgist measures. 1, municipal ownership of the Eugene Waterworks. 2, taxation of water power sites. 3, the direct election of U.S. senators. And 4, keeping valuable state-owned timberlands from being given to Southern Pacific. And these are really important issues that have implications all the way to today. Mason Gaffney wrote in his long career a lot about water rights in California in particular, and how the control of water rights from the 1800s on by a small group enabled them to really dictate terms of industrial and residential development that occurred thereafter. And those interests continue today to have an effect on what happens in countries and in parts of our country and in other countries based on who owns the water. It's a question of law, but it's also a question of morality. Should these entities have a monopolistic control over water and be able to charge others for its use? Is it a privilege, as Henry George argued? Well, in this discussion of the various positions on property rights in nature versus what we produce, John Bates Clark entered into this discussion with others. He and Seligman, supported by many of their colleagues and the generation of professors who graduated from their programs. Think about this. These were the great minds of economics in the late 1800s. They had hundreds of students who looked at them as mentors. And So are these young students who are seeking an opportunity to become professors in their own right in colleges and universities, get tenure, get stature, are they going to challenge the thinking of their mentors? They're certainly going to have a tough time getting published and getting teaching positions if in fact they do, because these are the leading figures at the time. And Clark and Seligman were at the vanguard of those who came to embrace the model of economic systems that came to be called neoclassical economics. And in their analysis, nature or land was removed as the first and primary factor of production with its own unique characteristics. This was an extremely important and destructive change in attitude from what the political economists were offering. There's just a little graph to show, image to show you the basis of neoclassical economics. It's all about inputs and outputs, about consumers and sellers, the flow of money from one part of the economy to another. And by creating this model, economists sidestepped the fundamental question, namely whether to be considered wealth ownable by individuals, an asset had to be produced by individuals, by labor using capital goods, that is by the use of tools and machinery. Well, by reclassifying nature as just another form of capital good, that meant that any asset that commanded a price in the market could then be included in the definition of private wealth. Considerations of the political economist disappeared from their analysis. There was no value judgment any longer made that nature is distinct in its characteristics and in the question of morality, whether or not human beings had a just claim to own nature. That's no longer part of the equation. All that the economist is going to do, as I talked about last week, is they're going to describe what is. They're not going to ask what ought to be. And so this continues to be a major part of the influence of what is then going to be taught to the next generations in universities. When Henry George was studying political economy, he learned that the term rent was used to describe that portion of the tangible wealth that resulted from differential quality of any natural asset. In particular, land. If you think about, for example, in the real estate market, what do realtors say is the great differential? It's location, location, location. You can have the same building built on two different locations, and the economic value, what people will be willing to exchange, to pay, to use that building, to operate in that building, is going to be very different based on the location and all the qualities that make one location superior to another, including the infrastructure that society has created, the system of roads, utilities, availability of clean water, even the quality of air. Is the air polluted? Or is the air largely free of pollution? All of these factors come into play, and when people are making a decision of where to choose to locate, all of these factors come into play, and none of those factors is caused by what any one individual does or does not do. It is a result of collective action, of societal action. And so that's part of the analysis that George brought to the question. And when the economists looked at the same question, they just simply acknowledged the fact that locations have different value. They didn't make any real effort to say, well, because of this difference, because of these differences, the rent that accrues to the one location over the other roughly belongs to society. No, they simply said the law says it belongs to individuals, so that's it. If we change the law, fine, but very few economists were going to argue for a change in law, even if they themselves, as individuals rather than as an economist, felt that the law should be changed. And again, when individuals who felt that moral principles were more important than economic analysis, and they stepped out of their role as an economist, they often found that their reputation within the discipline was frowned upon, that they might have had difficulties in getting promotions or positions, or they might have difficulty getting their writings published if their writings weren't consistent with the orthodox economics being taught. So when George wrote about this issue in Land, it's important to understand that he wasn't just talking about the surface of land. I mean, we know intuitively that occupying a piece of land, putting a building on it, that surface land has value, but it includes also the differential value of land that has subsurface minerals. And also it includes any asset that has a fixed or inelastic supply. These are terms in economics that are, if you've taken an economics course in a college or university, you've gotten introduced to supply and demand and this whole concept that some assets have a fixed supply or an inelastic supply. And that is absolutely true of nature. With regard to nature, this planet and all of its resources are all there is. We may be able to expand all there is if we can somehow occupy the moon or Mars and begin to increase the total area of nature that we have access to. But right now, this planet is all we have. And we cannot increase the supply of resources on the planet. All we can do with our labor and use of our technologies is change the form a bit. We can drain swamps. We can blow up mountains to get at the resources. We can do that kind of thing, but we haven't increased the net supply of land and natural resources that are available to us. And so we're going to talk a lot about rent in this course as we go forward. Well, getting back to Mason Gaffney and his observations about his discipline, he describes in this book that he co-wrote with Fred Harrison how the classification by neoclassical economists of land as just another form of capital and rent as a surplus income that was associated not just with land, but with labor and capital was used to affect public policy choices. What I mean by that, and what he meant by that, was if rent became associated with any above average compensation. So if you, Joe, and I had the same positions in some organization, and your compensation was 50% higher than mine, and was 50% higher than the average of everyone who came to that position with the same qualifications, the same basic experience, then half of your income would be considered rent because it was in excess. The same thing would be argued for the returns to investment in capital goods. So if someone is able to use a certain type of capital good very efficiently, and their output yields a revenue 50% higher than their competitors who are basically using the same technology, same resources, then that percentage is, by the neoclassical economics definition, rent, and therefore subject to taxation. And here's what Mace Gaffney says. He's attributing this to Clark and to Seligman and others. He writes, John Bates Clark did not stop at subsuming land in capital. He also makes a great point that wages are rent, too. The policy implication is that wages would make a good tax base. Seligman carried this forward into the income tax, leading to the present tax system, which raises much more from payrolls than property. And Mason Gaffney goes on to explain why this is exactly the opposite of what should be the case, that much more revenue should be raised from property than from payrolls. And he makes, I won't go into the economic argument now, but we'll eventually get to it. Now, I created this little image just to make the point that the confusion and distortions over time have only worsened. So in the language of economists today, we no longer have a three-factor system of production and distribution of wealth. We no longer have a two-factor system. We have a one-factor system. Everything is a type of capital. So we have natural capital, we have intellectual capital, we have human capital, financial capital, and entrepreneurial capital. And it gets even, it's why in your standard economics textbook, for example, if you go back to the 1950s when it really started, when they talked about the factors of production, land, labor, and capital were still sort of there, but entrepreneurship was considered to be something special, a new factor of production. In other words, the ability that I have as a person who labors is different conceptually from the ability that I have of a person who creates a business, who's an entrepreneur. And so that just adds a little bit more confusion to a discussion of what's the just distribution of wealth. The moral question is it someone who creates an entrepreneurship justified in a greater distribution of wealth than someone else who creates the same amount of wealth but not as an entrepreneur? These are public policy questions, and they have a moral component to them. Let me see. Okay. For some reason, the version I have up on the screen is missing one slide. I don't know where it went to, but the slide I wanted to show you next was how this was portrayed using the typical supply demand graph. And so, I showed one last week. The supply demand analysis is based on this whole concept that price will clear markets, that at the right price, those who supply a good or service will bring sufficient supply of that good or service to market, and those who demand that good or service are willing to pay that price. You have this whole concept of equilibrium. And when you have billions of these transactions going on in a society, in the world economy, the assertion that the economists are making is that the price mechanism that's involved will always clear markets. That is, market forces will determine the price at which both buyers and sellers agree. And they built their economic models on that assertion. The question that we'll deal with in this course is, was that an appropriate assertion to make? And if not, what was wrong with it? So the other big power broker in economics at the time became Johns Hopkins University. And that was established in the early 1870s by the fortune left by Johns Hopkins, who was a Baltimore businessman. And again, these individuals who endowed the universities, they chose the chairpersons in the departments, and they chose the chairpersons because of the writings that these individuals had produced, and they were sure that those individuals would come in and they would defend the status quo. They would defend the status quo that made Johns Hopkins as wealthy as he was made, of John D. Rockefeller as wealthy as he was made, and J.P. Morgan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That they were not going to, be someone who was going to start asking for reforms that would have made it more difficult for those individuals to become the power brokers that they were. So Richard Ely joins Johns Hopkins as its chair in 1881. He stays for a decade. And his influence over the discipline was further cemented by the fact that he was responsible for the founding of the American Economic Association in 1885. And there he became its president, served from 1890 to 1901. So Ely was someone who, if whatever he wrote was going to have a larger than life impact on what was going to be taught and written about for at least the next couple of generations, with some exceptions. Now, early in the 20th century, there was still a lot of controversy in the direction that was being taken by economics. Not all the political economists were gone. There were some still there. And even some of the younger graduates of economics programs in the universities weren't convinced by the teachings. And they were brave enough to challenge some of what they were taught. And one who I will talk about in this course a bit, and I've mentioned before, was a man named Harry Gunnison Brown. Mike and a few others probably know that name, pretty well. His history was interesting. He graduated from Williams College in 1904. He started his graduate studies at Ohio State University, and then he got his doctorate in economics at Yale in 1909, studying under Irving Fisher. Well, who was Irving Fisher? Fisher was basically one of the pioneers in the development of mathematical economics and econometrics. He's probably remembered most for something he wrote just before the stock market crash in 1929. A few weeks before the stock market crashed, he wrote an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, maybe both, that said, in his opinion, he thought that the markets had reached a plateau and would continue in a very stable way throughout the near future. So Fisher's analysis, built on neoclassical theory, was unable to successfully forecast the booms and bust cycles in the economy. And that continues to be certainly the most powerful criticism of mainstream economic theory today. And it's why, to some extent, political economy and the views of writers like Henry George are getting something of a second look. You may have read the newspapers about, after 2008, how university students of economics were just up in arms over what was being taught, because they said, I'm being taught all this theoretical stuff that has nothing to do with the real world. So what value is it of to me? And so a lot of discussion has occurred, and some universities have, in fact, started to modify what is being taught, bringing in different, perspectives, different economists who have different challenging points of view. And we'll have a lot more time to talk about them. Okay, so back to Harry Gunnison Brown. He gets his PhD in 1909, and he begins to teach at Yale, staying there through 1915, and then moves on to the University of Missouri. Throughout his entire teaching life, he remained convinced that economics was tainted by bias on behalf of vested interests, and he was willing to speak up about it. Now, to what extent that hampered his career, I don't know. The University of Missouri at the time was certainly not one of the premier universities in the country for recognition of its economics department. I mean, it wasn't part of, the Ivy League, et cetera. But Brown was well received as a teacher. He published extensively, wrote a number of books. And here's what he had to say about how economics had been taught and what economists were writing. The conclusions reached in economics may, in case they come to be widely understood, seriously affect the interests of various persons and classes. And if these classes are numerous or influential, they are fairly certain to find spokesmen who can give effective expression to their dissent. Such expression may not be scientific, but it will often be couched in forceful rhetoric and be reasonably plausible. And I'd love to have met and talked to, any of his students to see if what he taught stuck with them throughout the rest of their life. I've tried to do a little research on who some of his own PhD students were and what their writings were, but so far I haven't really found very much. So if anyone out there has any access to feels like doing any research, that would be a great question to pursue. Who did he influence, and how did, what economists of the next generation did he perhaps influence himself? Another economist who was still strongly influenced by political economy was this fellow, Glenn Hoover. And he first got his degree at the University of Washington in economics, and then he went to France to get his PhD at the University of Strasbourg. And one of his most significant writings was as editor of a book titled The 20th Century Economic Thought that came out in 1970. And Hoover had, as a younger man, studied political economy, studied Henry George's works, and he accepted George's analysis in a pretty significant way. And of the state of the economics discipline during his time as a professor, he wrote this: the failure to distinguish between land and the products of labor is not, as many believe, an ancient error, but is a relatively recent one. It took a lot of sophistry and obfuscation to make men believe that a free gift of nature should be treated in the same way as are the products of their own labor. It's, if something is repeated over and over again enough times, eventually people just stop questioning it and they accept it. And that's what the economic textbooks that were coming out during this era were beginning to convey. I know from my own experience as an undergraduate taking macroeconomics at a small state college, studying Samuelson, there was, I think, 1.5 pages devoted to Henry George in that book, and that's about it. And when I first started to teach this course at the Henry George School back in 1981, I wrote a paper. I titled it "From Samuelson to George: A Galbraithian Bypass." And I tried to think, I went back through my notes in the macroeconomics course that I took and found no reference at all to land or to Henry George. And on tax policy in Samuelson, it was mostly an argument on behalf of the progressive income tax. And there's some other nuances to it. But a lot of what we're going to talk about in this course, Samuelson had already decided was passé. It was no longer necessary to teach it because, again, this is the late 1960s. Economists had figured it out. They had a seat at the table. They had a seat at the table after the Second World War with the Truman administration and his Council of Economic Advisors, and they came up with demand management, a way to use fiscal and monetary policy to even out the swings in the economy. And we're still, living by those same influences today in terms of what economic policy is. Although right now in the United States, at least, I'm not sure if there is any economic policy other than the Federal Reserve's policy to contract or expand credit, create a whole lot more money to throw into the economy and to raise and lower interest rates. It's hard to know where we're going, but it doesn't seem like we're going in any direction that will achieve stability. I'm sure all of you have thoughts on that same issue. Now, I quoted Galbraith before, and he has some interesting observations about all this and his discipline. The economics discipline, as it evolved, began to teach us what they thought could explain how goods were produced and sold and why they were purchased. What was the human behavior behind all this that motivated us as consumers and producers? Galbraith, at one point in his career, he provided this response about the economics discipline and who it benefited. He wrote, "Economics is extremely useful as a form of employment for economists." And so this is coming from someone who's an insider. Now, there's also this, and again, those of you who are here, if you've taken economics in college, maybe if you're an economics major, this may not apply to you, although I'm not sure it does or not. But what is apparently the case is that few of us, of the millions perhaps of students who have taken courses in economics, end up absorbing much of what is taught. And this author, Robert Frank, and look who the co-author of this book is, Ben Bernanke. This is what they observed in their Principles of Economics textbook. They wrote, "Studies have shown that when students are tested about their knowledge of basic economic principles 6 months after completing an introductory economics course, they score no better on average than those who never took the course." Well, where does that leave us? Well, we're now going to start getting into the heart of this course. Our next task is to describe the essential elements of political economy, the essential terms used, and how they are defined in the study of how systems of political economy evolve and they function. So I need to open up the next lecture. All right. So this course, again, was designed for people who had never taken a course in political economy at the Henry George School primarily. But I noticed already quite a few of you, have been with the school for many years. So a lot of this is pretty redundant stuff for you, and I hope it's not putting you to sleep. But for teaching, when I teach this course, for example, in other locations, when I've taught it at Burlington County College or at Temple University's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, I'm mostly teaching people who've either never taken an economics course or it's been so long ago they've forgotten just about anything that they've learned. Bruce, you may be able to comment on that in terms of you've I think you've gone through this course with me at Temple, but so we're dealing with the basics, and already in our conversations here in the last 2 weeks, we've gone well beyond that because a lot of you have had the basic framework to ask the questions that you've asked. So what we're going to do now is begin from the beginning. And we're going to go into a discussion of the basics that Henry George looked at when he was performing his analysis. He was starting from scratch too, and he had to go back to the writings of his contemporaries and his predecessors, read all those books, take extensive notes, and figure out what are the important pieces of information that have been conveyed to me, how consistent are they, and if they aren't consistent, why aren't they, and how should I wade through this and find some consistency? So that's really what he was trying to do. And when he ended up writing his book, Progress in Poverty, he said to his readers, I'm going to give you clear definitions of all the terms I use. They may not be the only definitions that are available of these terms, but when I use them, you'll know exactly what I mean. So I'm hopefully going to try to do the same thing as we go through this course. So our definition of political economy is that it is the science that examines the means by which wealth is produced and distributed to the three factors of production, which are land, labor, and capital. And by capital, we're referring to tangible goods used in the production of other goods. And so, unlike Henry George, I will use the full term capital goods in this analysis. So I'm always talking about tangible goods that we've produced either by just our labor or with the use of tools and technologies as capital goods. And so here's basically the scheme. What about land? Land takes in the entire natural world. That includes our atmosphere and includes all other natural assets. So when we use the term land, it's not just the ground on which we stand or what's below the ground or the seas. It includes all of the natural assets that nature has provided to us and to which we have access. So it includes the forests. It includes natural resources below the ground. And it includes all the other kinds of natural assets that we would see, the seabeds, the seas themselves, the rivers, lakes, all the plants and animals that exist. All of these natural assets before human beings come in contact with them. When we come in contact with nature, we are going to, in many cases, apply our labor, and we're going to change the form of what we find in nature in some respects. All of the animals that are not domesticated are part of nature. And again, if we domesticate those animals, now something has changed. They're no longer out there roaming freely. We have captured them. We have taught them behaviors. We have used them to produce other animals. We've done genetic manipulation. We've done all sorts of things with those animals. And eventually they become part of the resources that we have access to, but they're no longer part of nature. I leave you with this last sort of slide about nature. And I want to just, why are these up here? Well, for example, I mentioned the satellite routes around the planet. Those that's an inelastic supply of a resource, because there's only so many routes around the planet that can be utilized before satellites start crashing into one another. And each of those routes has a different economic rental value based on how it travels. If it travels over highly populated areas of the planet, then more and more people are going to have access to whatever that satellite is providing, whether it's photographic information or communication for facilitate our use of telephones, etc. Then you have you know the airplane. Why is an airplane there? Well, takeoff and landing slots at airports have different rental values based on a couple of things. First of all, there's this: no two airplanes can occupy the same place at the same time. They have done that in the past, but the results aren't very good. So you have to ration, the timing, how many airplanes can take off at the same time. And we know, think about yourself, you would rather get to the airport at a reasonable hour in the morning and get home at a reasonable hour in the evening from your travel. So the takeoff and landing slots at 8 a.m. and returning at 7 p.m. are much more valuable than the airplane takeoff slots at 3 a.m. and returning from your flight at 3 a.m. Just, that's the market for them. And you have, all sorts of other resource values that are determined in the same way. That there's just, in many cases, an inelastic supply of that resource. Oil below the ground, natural gas below the ground, it's finite. It may be replenished over several million years as all of the animals and plants that exist today die off and deteriorate, and the planet goes through its cycle. In millions of years, they'll become fossil fuels again. But in the meantime, we have to find alternatives to those inelastic supply. And while we're dependent on fossil fuels, as the supply of those fossil fuels diminishes and there's no reasonable alternative provided, the price is going to go up. So this is what we're going to talk about. And we started off with the most important part of it, and that is looking at nature, the fact that nature is fixed by what we have, and that there are differential values to nature based on a number of factors that cause rents to exist. And from there, we'll pick up the story next week.